Sometimes a lesson returns so many times that we begin wondering if something is wrong with us. Why am I here again? Why does this pattern keep repeating? Why do I keep encountering the same kinds of people, the same fears, the same emotional reactions, the same questions, even after I thought I had already grown beyond them? And when those moments return, it can feel discouraging. Like growth should have been cleaner, more permanent, more linear. But what if growth was never meant to move in a straight line? What if the return of a pattern does not always mean failure? What if it sometimes means that awareness is deepening? You are listening to The Occult and the Apocalypse, where we explore the hidden and the revealed through patterns, symbolism, and awareness. Not to predict, but to notice, and not to conclude, but to understand. Many people experience growth as if it should happen once, a realization, a breakthrough, a healing moment. And afterward, the problem is supposed to disappear forever. But life rarely seems to move that way. Instead, many experiences seem to return in cycles. The same themes revisit, but often from a different perspective. A different season of life, a different level of awareness. Sometimes you revisit insecurity, but this time you recognize it faster. Sometimes conflict returns, but you respond to it differently. Sometimes grief resurfaces, but now there's more space around it. And sometimes lesson returns not because you failed to learn it, but because there's a deeper layer of it waiting to be seen. The same theme, deeper layer. And when we begin seeing life this way, something starts to soften. Because instead of experiencing recurring patterns as punishment or proof that we're broken, we begin seeing them as part of a larger unfolding. It may appear as stagnant returning, but it is actually movement. Not circles that trap us, but the cycles that evolve us. And maybe that's why so many people throughout history have described growth, healing, spirituality, and even existence itself through cycles. Not only because cycles are observable in nature, but because they seem to appear within human experience as well. Inside relationships, inside emotions, inside identity, inside society, and perhaps even inside consciousness itself. There's a scene in The Never-Ending Story where the characters realize that something hidden has to be named before the cycle can begin changing. And whether someone sees that as symbolically, psychologically, or spiritually, I think many people recognize that feeling in their own life. Sometimes a pattern continues not because we are weak, but because something inside has not fully been seen yet, not acknowledged, not named. And once we begin recognizing the deeper structure underneath the pattern, our relationship to it starts to change. I noticed this in my own life after my divorce. When I first began dating again, I thought I was choosing differently. And in some ways, I was. On the surface, the people I gravitated toward seemed very different from my ex-husband. Different personalities, different lifestyles, different ways of presenting themselves. But over time, I began recognizing something underneath those differences that felt strangely familiar. The same emotional energy, the same imbalance, the same subtle dynamics appearing in different forms. And that realization was uncomfortable because it forced me to look deeper than surface level change. It made me ask questions like, what was I still drawn toward? What was I still overlooking? What inside me had not fully changed yet? And I think many people experience something similar. A relationship pattern returns. An emotional trigger resurfaces. A fear that they thought they had already healed suddenly reappears. And the first instinct is often discouragement, to think, I thought I already worked through this. But sometimes the pattern returning does not mean you failed. It means that you are now able to see something that was previously invisible to you. The same theme, deeper layer. And often, awareness itself changes the cycle. Not instantly, not magically, but gradually. Because once something has been clearly seen, it becomes harder to continue participating unconsciously in the same way. And that seems to happen across many areas of life. Not only in relationships, but in identity, in healing, in spiritual growth, in the way we respond to fear, in the way we search for meaning. Patterns revisit, but awareness evolves. And maybe this is part of why emotional growth can feel so confusing at times, because many people expect healing to look steady, predictable, permanent. But emotionally, life often moves more like seasons than straight lines. There are periods when we feel grounded, clear, connected to ourselves. And then suddenly something activates again. An old fear, an old insecurity, an old emotional response. And it can feel as though we've gone backward. But often when we look more closely, something is different. Maybe the reaction lasts less time. Maybe awareness arrives faster. Maybe there's more compassion inside the experiences than there was before. The cycle returns, but not exactly in the same form. It's the same theme, but a deeper layer. And once we begin noticing this movement internally, it becomes difficult not to see the cycles reflected almost everywhere else in life as well. In nature, life rarely moves through straight lines. There are seasons, periods of growth, periods of harvest, periods of stillness, periods where something appears dormant before beginning again differently. There are cycles in sleep and waking, breathing in and breathing out, the tides moving in and out, the phases of the moon. Even ecosystems move through cycles of growth, disruption, adaptation, and renewal. And humans have observed these rhythms for thousands of years. There's a reason the song Turn, Turn, Turn resonated so deeply across generations. Its lyrics were adapted from Ecclesiastes 3. To everything there is a season, a time to plant, a time to harvest, a time to mourn, and a time to dance. A recognition that life moves through recurring phases and transitions, not frozen in one permanent state. And maybe that's part of why cyclical thinking appears so often in spiritual traditions as well. Because humans repeatedly noticed that experience itself seems to move rhythmically. Not externally only, but internally as well. Emotionally, spiritually, collectively. And perhaps that recognition emerged not only from belief, but from observation. And across many spiritual traditions and cultures, humans repeatedly describe existence through cycles. Not always in the same way and not with the same symbols or language, but with a similar recognition that life seems to move through recurring phases of growth, decline, renewal, forgetting, remembering, and return. Even within the Bible, there are recurring patterns of people drifting away from meaning, becoming consumed by external concerns, facing disruption or instability, then returning again, searching for deeper connection, purpose, or spiritual grounding. Periods of wandering, periods of rebuilding, periods of remembering what mattered after losing sight of it, and those themes continue appearing throughout history. Not necessarily as exact repetitions, but as recognizable movements inside human experience. Other traditions represented these cycles even more directly. In Hinduism, existence is often described through vast recurring ages called yugas, different eras unfolding through cycles of creation, growth, decline, destruction, and renewal. Not in a straight line, but as a repeating movement across immense periods of time. Many indigenous traditions also viewed life through cyclical relationships with nature, seasons, ancestors, and the returning rhythms of the earth and sky. In some traditions, even the movement of the sun carried symbolic meaning tied to death, renewal, and return. Time itself was often experienced less as a straight path and more as an ongoing relationship between past, present, future, land, memory, and community. In Buddhism, suffering and awakening are also often understood cyclically. People move through attachment, discomfort, awareness, release, and then return again to deeper levels of understanding. Even astrology in many forms reflects humanity's repeated attempt to understand life through recurring cosmic patterns and movements. Now, whether someone interprets these traditions literally, symbolically, spiritually, psychologically, or somewhere in between, I think it's meaningful that humans across so many different cultures repeatedly describe existence through cycles. Not only personal cycles, but collective ones, civilizational ones, spiritual ones. Because perhaps recurring patterns are not only something humans experience, but something humans have always noticed. And maybe that's part of why movements of disruption so often seem to precede periods of reflection, reevaluation, and transformation. Sometimes people return toward meaning after instability. Sometimes spirituality re-emerges after periods of excess, distraction, or disconnection. Sometimes communities begin rebuilding after periods of fragmentation, and throughout history, humanity seems to repeatedly move through cycles of forgetting and remembering. Not always perfectly, and not always permanently, but repeatedly. And when we begin looking at cycles this way, it becomes difficult not to notice them collectively as well. Not only inside individual lives, but inside entire cultures, entire generations, entire periods of history. There are moments where societies seem to move towards acceleration, more production, more consumption, more speed, more noise, more external validation, and for a while, these movements can feel exciting, progressive, expansive. But eventually, many people begin feeling something underneath them. Exhaustion, disconnection, burnout. A sense that despite having more stimulation, more information, more convenience, and more access, something meaningful has quietly eroded. And historically, humanity seems to revisit these kinds of tensions repeatedly. Not always in identical ways, but in recognizable patterns. Periods of expansion followed by periods of re-evaluation. Periods of external focus followed by renewed searches for meaning. Periods where people become heavily identified with systems, institutions, production status, or material survival. Followed by periods where many begin questioning whether those structures alone are enough to sustain human well-being. And maybe that's part of why so many people now seem drawn toward spirituality, reflection, nervous system healing, slower living, intentional community, authenticity, reconnection with nature, decentralization, building local support systems. It's not necessarily because humanity is failing, but because cycles of awareness may naturally create periods of reorientation. And when abrupt change happens collectively, people often begin asking deeper questions. Questions they may not have asked when life felt stable. What actually matters? What kind of life feels meaningful? What have we normalized that no longer feels sustainable? What have we sacrificed in exchange for speed, productivity, convenience, or constant stimulation? And throughout history, moments of disruption have often preceded periods of spiritual reflection, philosophical questioning, rebuilding, and reorganization. Not because suffering automatically creates wisdom, but because disruption often interrupts unconscious momentum. It forces reevaluation. It reveals what was hidden underneath routine. And sometimes it reminds people that external structures alone cannot fully sustain the human spirit. That seems to happen personally, collectively, and historically. The same theme, a deeper layer. And maybe that's why cycles can feel unsettling when we are inside of them. Because when an old cycle begins weakening, but a new cycle has not fully formed yet, people often experience uncertainty, disorientation, polarization, searching. And yet, within that uncertainty, there can also be possibility there. The possibility that awareness itself is evolving. Not perfectly, and not all at once, but gradually. As individuals begin questioning old patterns, community begin reorganizing around different values. And over time, what once seemed permanent can begin changing surprisingly quickly. What people prioritize changes. What people tolerate changes. What they believe is meaningful changes. And sometimes what initially feels like collapse may partly be transition. And maybe this is why cycles can feel both frustrating and sacred at the same time. Because while we're living inside them, we often experience only the repetition, the discomfort, the uncertainty. The feeling that we are somehow back to where we started. But when we step back far enough, something else begins to appear. Not exact repetition, but movement. The same themes revisiting through different generations, different circumstances, different identities, different levels of awareness. The same theme, deeper layer. And perhaps growth was never meant to remove us completely from cycles. Perhaps growth changes the way we move through them with more awareness, more discernment, more compassion, and more perspective. More ability to recognize what is happening while it's happening. Not only personally, but collectively, spiritually, and historically. And maybe that's part of what humans have been trying to describe for thousands of years through stories, spiritual traditions, symbols, rituals, and myth. Not simply that history repeats itself, but that consciousness itself may evolve through recurring experiences. That humanity may repeatedly move through cycles of forgetting and remembering, disconnection and reconnection, excess and simplification, fear and awakening, not in a perfect upward line, but more like a spiral. Returning to familiar places while still gradually changing. And if that's true, then perhaps recurring patterns are not always a sign that we are trapped. Perhaps it's sometimes that they are invitations. Invitations to notice more deeply, to respond differently, to become more conscious participants in our own lives. And maybe that changes the way we experience repetition itself. Because instead of asking, why is this happening to me again? We may begin asking, why is this happening to me again? And what am I able to see now that I couldn't see before? What has changed in the way I respond? What deeper layer is revealing itself here? And perhaps that shift alone changes the cycle. Not because difficulty disappears forever, but because observation and awareness transforms our relationship to it. The same theme, a deeper layer. And maybe that's why spiritual growth can sometimes feel less like escaping life and more like learning how to move through it consciously, to exist within the cycles without becoming completely consumed by them, to be in the world while still seeing the larger patterns moving through it. And perhaps that perspective is part of what allows people to move through uncertainty with more curiosity instead of only fear. Because if cycles continue unfolding, then endings may also contain beginnings. Periods of disruption may also contain reorientation. And what feels like repetition may sometimes be evolution taking place slowly enough that we only recognize it clearly in hindsight. So, what themes in your own life seem to keep returning? And what if those returning patterns are not only asking to be escaped, but understood more deeply? What if awareness itself changes the cycle? But I'll leave that for you to think about. Come back next week while we explore the tarot card, the Tower, what it means, and how it relates to your life and the greater cycle within the world currently. In the meantime, thank you for being here with me and helping me take the occult and the apocalypse and see it as just the hidden and the revealed. I'll see you next week.